I'm Ricardo Nunez. Before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to Anna, one of our interpreters, to give a little introduction about our interpretation.
Hola, mi nombre es Ana Karina y mis pronombres son ella. Y estoy aquí hoy, el día de hoy, con mi compa y con intérprete Ale. Sus pronombres son ella. Somos miembros del colectivo de justicia del lenguaje Bancha Lenguas, basado en Bulbancha, Luisiana. Hoy estamos proveyendo interpretación simultánea del inglés al español como parte de nuestro esfuerzo por crear espacios multilingües. Hi, my name is Ana Karina, and my pronouns are her and hers. And I'm joined today by my comrade and co-interpreter, Ale, whose pronouns are she, her. We are members of the Bancha Lenguas Language Justice Collective based in Bulbancha, Louisiana. Today, we'll be providing simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish as part of our effort to create multilingual spaces. Bulbancha es la palabra chocta, que significa la tierra donde se habla muchos lenguajes. Bulbancha is the Choctaw word, which means the land where many languages are spoken. En Bancha Lenguas nos esforzamos en crear un espacio para que todos aquí presentes puedan entender y ser entendidos en el idioma en que nos sentimos más poderosos. At Bancha Lenguas, we strive to create space for everyone here to understand and be understood in the language in which we feel most powerful. Notará que estamos usando la letra E al final de palabras binarias. Esto no es un error. Es nuestro intento de crear un lenguaje más inclusivo e incluir personas a todos los géneros. You will notice us using the letter E at the end of gendered words. In Spanish, it's not an error. It is us attempting to create a more inclusive language and include people of all genders. To access interpretation platform, if you are using a computer, you will see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen with the word interpretation. Click it and select the channel with the language of your choice. We will be using English and Spanish, so make sure that you're on the right channel. For smartphone or tablet, look for 3 dots that read More. Click on that to make your selection. When making your selection, you will see an option to mute original audio to hear only the voice of the interpreter. To hear original audio, you may leave it unmuted. You can change your selection at any time. Lastly, don't suffer in silence. If you have any problems with hearing us or the speakers, please send a message in the chat. Para acceder a la plataforma de interpretación, si estás usando una computadora, vas a ver un icono de globo al pie de tu pantalla con la palabra interpretación. Haz clic sobre él y selecciona el canal de tu lenguaje preferido. Vamos a estar usando inglés y español, entonces por favor elige el idioma que necesites. Para teléfono inteligente o tableta, busca 3 puntos que leen más. Haz clic para hacer tu selección. Al elegir tu idioma, verás una opción para silenciar el audio original. Haz clic en ella para escuchar solo la voz del intérprete. Para escuchar el audio original, puedes dejarlo sin silencio. Puedes cambiar tu selección en cualquier momento. Por último, no sufras en silencio. Si tienes cualquier problema escuchándonos a nosotros o a los presentadores, por favor, envíe un mensaje en el chat. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone, to Co-opalooza Week. This is a week where we at the Sustainable Economies Law Center are trying to raise $20,000 to support our work democratizing workplaces everywhere. All month long, we've been sharing stories, resources, and new ideas from members from our team working with worker cooperatives and worker self-directed nonprofits. Today's event is Interdependence, worker cooperative advocacy, and the movements for the environment, immigrant rights, racial justice, and labor unions in the United States. So we have a couple more events left this week, just 2 more after today. And they're both tomorrow. One is where folks will be able to meet the authors of the first of its kind in the nation worker cooperative legal practice guide for attorneys wanting to work with worker cooperatives. And then tomorrow evening, we'll have a Co-opalooza virtual mix and mingle. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsors for making this event possible and sponsoring Co-opalooza this week. And if you have any tech questions, please feel free to message Tobias, whose name in the chat is Sustainable Economies Law Center. So today's conversation on interdependence is just that. It's meant to be a conversation. So please drop any questions that you have for the panelists or the host, myself, or my co-host Yasi, into the chat, and we'll hopefully get to them. We do have just an hour or less than that now to have this conversation. But before I get started, I wanted to set a little context about why we're having this conversation. The Sustainable Economies Law Center has been doing cooperative advocacy and forging cooperative or policy efforts, both locally, statewide, and nationally with our partners, like at the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. And over that decade plus time of doing policy advocacy, we've learned a lot, and we still have questions. Like, how does the worker cooperative community's policy advocacy support social justice and environmental stewardship? How does policy advocacy help build a future in which labor is both worker controlled and liberatory? And also, now that the worker cooperative community has moved from the margins and is effectively contesting for power, resources, and government support, thank you, I'll go slower. What new opportunities and threats lie ahead? And so that's part of what the conversation, that's the seed of the conversation that we want to have today. And so when we're talking about this participatory policymaking, I think a lot of our organizations are trying to do just that, make it participatory. Sustainable Economies Law Center, while we are a democratic workplace, we are also a nonprofit, and nonprofit advocates have the financial means to advocate for policies, but it also can place those same nonprofits at the center of the conversations, as opposed to the workers and communities that we're advocating for and on their behalf. And so today we'll be hearing about some projects that are trying to recenter worker voice and power, about how to do policy advocacy differently. And also, just as a last piece of context setting, we are in a particular legal and statutory environment that forces organized labor, particularly unions, to contest for power in very small and defined spaces. And so as we're seeing across the country, more militant or more democratic organizing in the union spaces, there's a lot of emerging conversations and spaces to build bridges between movements. And so as we're fighting to build cooperative power in parallel with unions, fighting for worker power and organized labor, how can we start to bridge those two communities in more intentional ways? And as we've seen over the last year with the COVID pandemic and the uprisings, the racial justice uprisings across the country, we are in a new political and legal terrain. And so how can we build power from this new terrain? What are new ways of fighting for that power? So that's why we're here today. How can policy efforts build worker power through worker-owned cooperatives and support other movements for organized labor, immigrant rights, gender justice, the movement to fight climate change, and the movement for Black lives? So now I'll pass it over to my co-host, the amazing Yasi Eskandari, Selk's attorney and policy director. Yasi?
Thanks, Ricardo. Hi, everyone. I'm going to introduce the speakers. We have a great panel today. First, we have Esteban Kelly, who is the executive director for the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and is also a worker owner and co-founder of AORTA, which is the Anti-Oppression Resources and Training Alliance. Esteban, or the cooperative, is a worker co-op that builds capacity for social justice projects through intersectional training and consulting. Flecker Vera is also joining us. Flecker is a worker owner and director of Sustainergy Cooperative, as well as a community organizer and co-founder of Co-op Cincy. And we're joined by Elizabeth Ruiz, who is a member of the Progressive Cleaning Solutions Cooperative in New York City, and the NICNOC and a member of the NICNOC Advocacy Council as well. So we're going to kick it off today with asking Elizabeth some questions. And welcome, Elizabeth. I wondered if you could start by just saying a few words about what is NICNOC for people who don't know about the network yet, and what are some of the roles that it's playing in economic development, in immigrant rights, and any other key issues that you're noticing in New York City.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Elizabeth. Pues en estar en NICNOC, para mí estar en el Consejo de Abogacía, fui parte del primero.
Advocacy board, I was one of the first, and I still am. We're an organization that supports the immigrant community, also Black folks and cooperatives. We're also supporting the worker fund, excluded worker fund, and how to fill out their applications. In this aspect, we have Zenaida, who was given the opportunity because they're also on the advocacy board to support filling out paperwork. We're also doing stuff around housing, supporting so many injustices from landlords, right? Immigrant community has been severely impacted in these moments of the pandemic that has passed. And to resolve this, the problems that are living, the displacement and evictions that are being lived, NICNOC has worried in terms of the in terms of racial justice, right? Black folks has been super discriminated, abuses that they experience from the police to the Black community, to Latinx folks, through immigrant folks. They have joint efforts to continue supporting the coalitions. Until what point can NICNOC, I can say, has been able to look out for things that impact their lives and communities. They offer proposals for the problems that are faced every day. As I mentioned before, the worker fund, we support them because many of them don't have their papers, they don't have the proper documentation, and we can see how we can might be able to support these folks, because it is just for everyone to have access to this fund that is really needed to cover the needs of our folks. We also inform other cooperatives and support their needs in immigration spaces, but sometimes funds are not enough to cover all the proposals. We need to grow the fund. So I hope that people contribute. In my life, NICNOC has helped. I am a worker owner of a cooperative. They have supported my growth. They've supported me to be able to be a worker owner of a co-op, to support the immigrant community, my community, and everything that is needed, that we need in this moment. We need a lot of support from organizations, and we need that support.
Thank you. That was really helpful and a really great demonstration of all the ways that NICNOC is engaging in the city. I'm curious if you can say more specifically, because one of the ways that I always refer to NICNOC is that it's really creating a model for how the members of worker-owned cooperatives can actually engage in policy work directly, rather than have, sort of being represented by other people whose job it is to advocate for them. And so I'm curious if you can say, Elizabeth, a little bit more about how does NCNOC and how does the NCNOC Advocacy Council specifically use policy or identify its policy priorities by centering the workers. And so how do the workers of worker cooperatives in the city actually have their voice heard, and how do they take leadership and really drive the policy work that NCNOC is doing?
Bueno,
Well,
no somos como Consejo de Abogacía.
the Council of Advocacy, NCNAC,
Nos ayuda en las
it helps us with understanding the policies, supporting them in the organizations,
coaliciones,
in the coalitions,
alzar la voz, dar propuestas.
raise up our voices, make sure that we're putting in proposals, trying proposals that are going to create solutions around these policies that affect the community of immigrants and also racial communities, Black communities, to give solutions and, more than anything, to take them to the organizations and support organizations in these really important themes that are actually being lived. Involve the members, prepare them, support them.
Wonderful.
Para
Thank
dar
you.
un cambio.
To make a change. Further along, that's positive, and this that we're living, that we can turn it and also feel our voices raised, all of us. Thank you.
That's so important. Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing. And I also want to make some space for Flecker to share about his experience. And so, Ricardo, I'll pass it back to you to ask Flecker some questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Flecker, thanks for joining us. From Sustainergy and Co-op Cincy. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Co-op Cincy and about the work you all do building an economy that works for all.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Excited about this. And so Co-op Cincy is a nonprofit that works with individuals and organizations to create family-sustaining jobs in the shape of worker co-ops. We do a lot of incubation of businesses. We have about 14 projects in the pipeline right now. And we also are buying existing businesses and converting them. And we have a Co-op U course. It's a business course designed for co-ops. That's mainly what we do.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think you've been working at the intersection of worker cooperatives and unions for a little while. And so I'm curious, how have you seen worker cooperatives and unions build bridges towards building collective worker power? And how do you see worker cooperatives fitting into the future of labor organizing for unions?
Yeah, so union and cooperatives have a long history of building bridges together in the United States. For example, after the Civil War, unions and the Knights of Labor, was a union, embraced cooperatives as a strategy to empower workers. According to historian Steve Lincoln, the Knights of Labor represented about 750,000 members and about 200 co-ops, workers, consumers, and producers. Once this reached scale and became a threat to the status quo, they were strategically, systematically dissolved, were purchased, dismantled, and 3 years, most of them were gone, unfortunately. More current collaborations between unions and worker co-ops are, for instance, the agreement between Mondragon and the Steelworkers Agreement in 2009, that they joined forces to create an economy that works for all. Co-op Cincy, my co-op Sustain Energy, and also co-op, other union co-ops are a product of this agreement. And so the idea is to import this proven, not perfect, but proven business model that has transformed the city of Mondragon, going from 51% employment to 20%, to full employment within 2 decades in the 60s. So that's the model we are working on. And other ways that to build power is, union provides a lot of political capital, and small co-ops can, like in our experience, that our union allies can be like, Mr. Vice Mayor, I'd like you to please meet with our friends from Sustainable Co-op Cincy to speak about this awesome idea, and we get a meeting. So the political capital is a very, very strong tool for speaking, getting your voice heard with legislators. Also help us implement financing tools for energy efficiency in commercial buildings, properly assess clean energy. I won't go into detail, but it's a financing tool that actually is shaping the energy efficiency industry in the country, and the unions help us to implement this. I can go on, but the most particular example, or the most unions that have been the most active with worker co-ops is the steel workers, also UFCW Local 75, and many more, but they help with grants and hundreds of thousands of dollars in TA and staff to incubate our union co-ops, do research and so forth. They gave us loans to launch, and they also help us get clients, help us get a less expensive, I should say, health insurance, and they provide tools. They also provide like free college for union members, which allows Sustain to attract and retain talent. And all these things really impact our bottom line. Well, the collective bargaining agreement is very important to secure democracy and fairness in the workplace, and many more things, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Flecker. I really appreciate it. So it sounds like there has been the collaboration between unions and worker cooperatives have really started to bear some fruit in Cincinnati. So that sounds very heartening, and I think we'll get into a little bit more of that later when we can have more of a discussion between participants. But I'd like to pass it back to Yasi to ask Esteban some questions.
Sure. Thanks, Esteban, for joining us. Yeah, I guess my first question is, how would you say the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives work actually advances a new social, economic, and environmental agenda, and how does the Federation's work intersect with related movements?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I've recognized a lot of the ways in which that work is interconnected. And it's also helpful coming right after Flecker, who helped to illustrate the rich history of unions and union organizing. And one of the things that feminists and immigrant organizers have taught me over the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years is they've pointed out a lot of the gaps in how we tend to, in the US, fail to recognize the full spectrum of labor organizing, that we often reduce it to unions and union organizing. That unions are one particular aspect of labor organizing, one strategy. And so I see unions alongside worker cooperatives, worker centers, other kinds of organizing, groups who are organizing freelancers and independent contractors, independent workers, restaurant workers, farm workers, as all part of a much broader movement, alongside reproductive labor and things that are unwaged work, as the bigger work that we're moving in, or the larger horizon that we're trying to move forward. And it's where we feel like we can have all the affinity. We as worker cooperatives can have, all the affinity and solidarity alongside not only unions, but all these other groups who are really pushing for recognition, power, and certain kinds of concessions that we need around our work and our labor. And so, what's, I think, really powerful about how we advance that inside the Worker Co-op Federation is I think we do some similar things to how unions organize around access to benefits, collective bargaining, pushing for industry standards, and also public policy, things that need to be changed in certain sectors or industries. But what's different is that in addition to pushing for those concessions, and I see unions as, and I think Flecker actually just said this, extracting certain concessions from capital, worker co-ops are owning that capital. And you all just framed this out in the intro. But that's of larger significance than it might seem initially. It's not just, oh, that's an inversion, or, oh, that's an extra thing that worker co-ops do. It's pretty significant to not just have to say, we're negotiating because you have the capital and here's some things that we want around the conditions of our work day, our work hours, our wages, but to actually be like, oh, well, we own the capital. So from that position, how are we governing it? How are we leveraging it as an asset, not only on behalf of the workers, but when you're a worker co-op, you're also people embedded in family structures, in community structures, even in non-traditional family structures. So when we get into like queer horizons of how we think about kinship and interdependence, that has everything to do with feminism. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there for that initial question. I could keep going.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. I guess one follow-up question that I really wanted to hear your sort of take on this.
Una pregunta.
Yeah. Oh. Was that the interpreter? I guess not. I wanted to see what your take is on how this moment is different. So you and I collaborate in multiple different spaces, and particularly on policy. And it's seeming to me like this moment is different from even several years ago. And the pace is picking up, and we're seeing worker ownership it's becoming almost mainstream. We're coming out from the margins, as we were saying earlier. And how is this moment unique from your perspective for worker cooperatives, but also other movements that are connected with our goals? How is this time different, and how are we actually contesting for power in a different way? And what are some of those threats? What are some of the new threats that we need to be aware of? Not just opportunities, but what are some of the ways that we can really be ahead of the curve?
You're opening up more questions than we have time for, but believe me, if I didn't have to speak slowly, I would touch on all of that. Also, you might need to unmute and remind me to slow down, because you just asked the most exciting question to me. So I'm going to try to like rein it in with your support. Okay, here's the thing. The movements themselves, which are in a realignment and an inflection point. And let's just oversimplify and say there's like climate justice over here. There's racial justice, and I think you sort of framed it around some of the work that the Movement for Black Lives is doing, for example. And there's, I'm just going to simplify and say gender justice, but I actually think it's tied with some of these other pieces. All of those movements are finally eschewing the kind of non-profitization that has plagued the struggle to win power and even advanced militancy going back to the 1980s, following the militancy of the 60s and 70s, not just in the US, but all around the world, right? And that was an explicit tactic from capital and from the state to quell those movements by formalizing and professionalizing those issues. All to say, they're now moving into alignment and not saying, but this thing is what I care about the most. And so here's our campaign and strategy and vision. Now it's become undeniable, not only for the movement strategists, and I count myself among them, but for rank and file people and people who don't think about broader liberation and change. Like everyday people now see the connection between racial justice and climate justice. Like you can't, it's becoming harder and harder to even pretend to separate these things. And we just heard an introduction from our interpreters who are based in Louisiana. I mean, the Gulf Coast is like really front and center. My community, right, communities of color that are on the front lines of climate justice. And it's not led by white national nonprofits that have been around for 100 years. It's led by communities of color. And I don't just mean Black communities in the Gulf Coast, Vietnamese communities in Louisiana. I mean, it's all of these communities of color, right? Many of whom are refugees from other places. We've just been watching the crisis of Haitian refugees, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what's unique and different about this moment, is that we no longer the negative way to put it is that we no longer have the luxury of thinking separately, but the positive way of spinning it is that our interdependence has never been clearer. And so I've been organizing for 25 years now in each of these spaces, by the way. Like I was an environmentalist in the 90s and my friends were doing tree sits and we would whatever the movements, you pick your thing and I was doing some version of it, even if it wasn't sophisticated. And it felt like I was spread thin. And it brings me joy. You could see how my face is lighting up. It brings me joy to just have the moment of, oh my God, what a relief. We're finally all talking to each other. We're in the same rooms. My white homies who are like, yes, invite climate justice. They're understanding in a new way with rigor and precision how our strategies are tied up, are tied to racial justice, multiracial organizing, and stepping back and leaning into centering the communities that are most directly impacted by the harm that's coming. And by the way, the common denominator, y'all, is democracy. These are the climate justice people saying it. It's the prison abolition people saying it. It's the gender justice people who talk about the epidemic of sexualized violence and centering transformative justice as the solution, which is part of the other organizing that I just did, by the way, for 15 years, that it all comes back. Transformative justice is all about democracy. It's having the skills to de-escalate, to communicate, to facilitate, to navigate conflict, and to center relationships and trust in our solutions that decenter prisons and criminalizations, that humanize even people who've caused harm, especially people who've caused harm. That's how we get to abolition. That's how we get to racial justice. There is no racial justice without abolishing prisons, and abolishing prisons isn't having your favorite lefty comrade, in the White House or something. That's not how it happens. It happens through the slow, deliberative process of expanding economic democracy so that communities are capable of even envisioning a world where we don't have to call the police and we don't have all this litigation and all these laws that are criminalizing behavior, but that it's centering a different set of values and principles around our own needs. And that to me has everything to do with not just economic democracy broadly, but cooperatives and worker cooperatives especially, because those are the skills we're bringing to solving everyday kinds of problems and challenges, managing, governing your workplace, the logistics of whatever business you're running. And I'm in it with my co-op. I'm resourcing. I mean, all of you are my members, from Sustainergy to Selk to Knick Knock. You're all members. So, right, there really is this whole community. And I think that my vision then isn't just that we're able to plug into movements, but that movements, and it's starting to happen already, turn to all of us, those of you in this webinar, as advisors, as resources who have a little bit of a head start in doing this work of everyday democracy.
Thanks so much, Esteban. I could talk to you about this stuff all day. And I did realize when I asked you that question that we were going to go on about it a little bit. And I'm glad you did, because it's so important. These are the really big questions we have to be asking ourselves as we do the day-to-day work together. So before we open it up to audience questions, and again, please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat box for us in English or Spanish. And before I do that, though, I wanted to give the panelists, the three of you, to ask each other questions. So if any of you said something that kind of triggered a question for, please bring it up, and let's have a little conversation together, and then we can open it up for others.
Yeah, this is Flecker, and I appreciate the seven broadening the labor movement, which is more than unions, worker centers, and the ones you mentioned, but also faith community, historically supporting worker rights as well. And my question is about, like, I'm curious about if you see any current opportunities or any current projects that the Federation is working, the U.S. Federation of Worker Coops is working with any particular union at this point?
Yeah, there's kind of a lot going on. I think some of the most inspiring and in some ways the most opaque to me work that's happening with worker co-op development and unions is with SEIU, the Service Employees Union, and especially the SEIU 1199 chapters that are doing work around healthcare. And again, the connections to Yassi's question earlier are just really clear between gender justice, right? Like pink collar jobs, care work, the infrastructure bill that's happening not happening, who knows what's happening, on the Hill, right? It's looking at these questions of healthcare, childcare as part of the infrastructure of our society. And so those are live conversations. There are deals and projects happening on the order of tens of millions of dollars, and partnerships and advocacy, to Elizabeth's point earlier, at the state level around like what kind of regulations are in the way of thriving jobs and workplaces that address the problems we're in nowadays. The only other thing I'll say, because I could go in so many directions on this question, is right now our members are in the process of actually voting on a proposal that came out of our union co-ops council. We have a handful of grassroots member councils. Members sit on, it's not everyone can be on the board. And so we have all these structures and leadership pipelines for engagement and participation on different committees. And most of you who are spotlighted know this because you've served on various ones. And so our union co-ops council that really is the site for addressing this opportunity to get really strategic and to do education for our members about unions and opportunities to partner with various labor unions. That they drafted a proposal that our members are voting on right now to set out a series of principles for what it looks like to do development for democratic workplaces or cooperatives inside of contexts where union or other kinds of labor organizing is happening. And it's like, well, it's overdue, but it's also so awesome that that's finally happening. And we deliberated about it at our annual member meeting a week ago. And so far, it looks like it's likely to pass. But those kinds of things send a clear signal that it's unequivocal that we're friends of unions and we're trying to find the best way to collaborate. And if anything, our solidarity is with unions even more so than with nonprofits who might share a vision or a strategy or a grant deliverable about developing cooperatives, especially for conversions. So those are just a couple of the things that are live right now.
Thanks for that, Esteban. Appreciate it. Actually was wondering, we've been talking about, and we'll get to the audience questions in a second, but I was wondering, Elizabeth, we've been talking about the power of participating democratic spaces. You talked a bit about New York City network of worker cooperatives and their advocacy council, and that you participate on it. And I'm wondering how what's been talked about really putting this power back into the hands of workers, how it's impacted you. Like, what's been your experience and what's been the experience that you witnessed as you have stepped into a workplace and onto a council that is really asking you to respond to and answer very difficult and complicated questions.
Bueno,
Well,
sí, claro, yo sé que es muy difícil.
yeah, of course. I think that it is very difficult. The questions about power, more so than anything, to be on an advocacy council. But how do I want to describe this? For me, to be a part of these really important ideas like the Council of Advocacy, we have to have solutions and proposals, because it's not, NICNAC will give us the tools and the support that's necessary to be able to develop ourselves as people, as leaders. And well, more than anything, our growth. They offer us a lot of capacity. I still have to learn a lot more about advocacy, but in the years that I've been here, I've been involved in a lot of different needs that the immigrant community and the Black community needs, how things are affected, how we could say solutions, and it's not easy because proposals are taken and we have to really support these movements and the organizations and give them solutions.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we'll move to some of the questions posed by the audience. So the first one, and this is any of the panelists can jump in, but around how do you reconcile the misunderstandings prevalent in communities about cooperatives? So Indy Rishi shared that when they brought up cooperatives at a local city council, local city hall meeting, where they were going through a budget crisis, and that they're also in the Bay Area, which is a progressive area. Several left-leaning council members and staff labeled labeled cooperatives as communist and not possible. So I'm wondering from any of the panelists, what has been your experience to try to overcome this, those types of labels or misconceptions about cooperatives?
Okay. First of all, sorry, this is Esteban. Communism is possible and is happening in various parts of the world presently and historically. So setting that aside, it just clearly comes from a place of, I don't want to say ignorance with like an edge to it. I just mean like literally they're uninformed about cooperatives, and that's common. So, there's a lot of reason to be patient with people and their misunderstandings of cooperatives generally. And I think worker cooperatives in particular, because I mean, worker co-ops are like less than 1% of the cooperative activity in this country, even, let alone in the world. And so people are often gonna falsely equate worker ownership with all the other forms of cooperation, housing and utilities and different kinds of consumption. And I think starting with just centering the worker and being like, this is actually entirely different than that, because this is a cooperative where the basis of membership are the workers, not the shoppers, not who's getting a cool discount, not the tenants. All those things are great. They are cousins, like we can be in community with them, but this is a different thing. And starting with that, first of all, it depends on who you're talking with, really. If they need to hear the like impressive corporate things about Mondragon, then trot out those stories, give them case studies. If it's as simple as sending them a link, that's useful. Oftentimes I find that storytelling and anecdotes are the way to get through to people. Because what's different about stories from data or statistics is that it sticks with people. You can hear a thing and understand it in the moment if it's just a statistic. If it's an anecdote, if it's a story, you don't forget it. You're telling it at a dinner party 2 weeks later. So harvesting those stories, find your own story and share it. And the closer to home it is, the easier it is to resonate and land with people. And I mean, if you're in California, the question is coming from California. You're chock full of stories. There's a website, speaking of resources, called becomingemployeeowned.org. And if you go there, we've collected stories for exactly that purpose. And it's really geared less toward communists and more toward business development, city, municipal employees, elected officials, business owners, small business owners from traditional businesses, to sort of tell stories of what it was like to convert the business to being worker owned. There's videos, there's pictures, there's short little blurbs, and you can screen it for different industries depending on what is going to resonate in that context. So that's a great place to start. You can absorb those stories yourself and then share it personally as your own like anecdote about things you've heard of, things that are happening now.
Thanks, Esteban.
Yeah, if I can add something briefly,
Yeah.
We are based in the Midwest, so there's a strong base of conservatives. And when we go and do sales for energy efficiency, when you get these people that maybe is not happy that I'm in their house, and their idea is that when you speak about these type of things, they think, oh yeah, communism. But when you start speaking to them, but this is not about communism, this is about sharing profit, about sharing losses. This is not free. Something is not free lunch. You have to buy a share, and you have skin in the game. When you speak in their language, now they're like, "Oh my gosh, this is great!" And you have people that are very conservative buying our products because they want to support. I use even the language. We're building America great again, and they love it because really, it's people that have been screwed by the system. They are working class folks that have been told lies about, and they really think that immigrants are really stealing their job when it's not true. So really, it's the education piece of it. Not still speaking to working class conservatives, keep a relationship with them, and telling this whole the way it really is. And in our experience, when they hear that it's about people sharing profit and all that, they love it. haven't seen one conservative that doesn't like this concept. Sorry for speaking fast there. I got excited.
Yeah, this is Esteban again. Just to add to that, I think that's right. Centering business ownership, right? Know your audience. If it's not about the workers, center ownership. It's like we're talking about small businesses. Start with small businesses, even though not all worker co-ops are small businesses. That's why everyone's in favor and supports cooperative organizing and legislation. I mean, we're meeting with Republican senators next week in Washington, D.C., as well as Democratic senators, which, by the way, are also very conservative people. And it's because we represent a business solution and we represent their communities. People respond to that. If you just use business language, you're good to go. Like, everyone supports small mom and pop businesses. And by the way, given the economic crises that we're just in over and over again in this century, it's an opportunity for asset development where people might not have the opportunity for home ownership or developing other assets. So if you can talk about it that way, it doesn't need to be using the language of community wealth building or things that might rub them the wrong way, but just being like, what other solutions you got? What other assets do you think people are going to have to be able to have an asset that can be the engine for wealth building or the collateral that you can leverage against in order to get some of your other needs met and navigating the uncertainty of climate apocalypse and all the other things coming? So business ownership, asset development, lead with some of those more conservative talk. It's also true. It's not spin, it's true.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'll lift up that the language and the framing that we use is so critical. And that co-ops are a bipartisan issue, but also noting in the chat, Indy shared a comment that it feels like a serious barrier that Democrats in a decision-making space are ignorant and dismissive of cooperatives. So there's a lot of work to do, but at the same time, we're making so much headway in other areas. I'd like to lift up another question from an audience member, from Matt. Matt says, I'm interested to hear more about democracy, particularly the connections between union democracy and co-op democracy in joint development projects. More money, more government money equals more opportunities for top-down approaches.
Yeah. My children just arrived. They will be like, can you reframe the question real quick?
Of course.
I heard part of it, but I want to make sure I understood it.
Yeah. This participant is wondering if they could hear more about the connections between union democracy and co-op democracy in joint development projects, which might mean in collaborating and working together and perhaps getting government money for opportunities to support that collaborative work.
Mm-hmm. So in our experience, sometimes people ask me, if you're a co-op, we're only 8 folks, we're a small business. Why do you need a union? You're owners, you're happy. And what the truth is that when you're a small, you know people, you have relationships, you have trust. But once you grow, those relationships start being dissected and the co-op culture gets diluted. And then, well, majority, if it's anti-gay or men or whatever it is, can oppress the smaller group. So for us to make sure the democracy is permanent, we want to have a reinforcing mechanism, which is a union contract that actually has a legal document that stipulates the process of every worker has to be treated, even terminated. You have to stick to this contract for everybody, you like it or not. So that brings like a third party to make sure that things stay fair or to minimize discrimination, at least. And for us, it's very important because once workers believe that they are true owners, really you get efficiencies. Your workers perform better, your customers are happier. But if they don't believe they are co-ops, so you are on a co-op in paper, I mean, all the benefits of being an efficient business get diluted. So for us, that's a big component. In terms of resources, if I understand the question properly, getting resources, it depends on the union. Some unions are very progressive and open to try new things. I mean, unions have been dying for the last 50 years. And now because unions are designed to defend. They protect workers, protect rights, immigrant rights, and so forth. The co-op movement is really a very innovative tool for unions to be able to offend, to attack, because now you restructure business from the inside, placing the worker in the center of the decision-making process, really empowering workers. Well, I stop there, but that's how we see it.
Thanks, Flecker. In the next, I want to give each panelist actually 30 seconds to say, if people who are participating in this conversation today want to get engaged and they're really inspired by what you've shared, how can they plug in? How can they get involved? Maybe I'll kick it off with Esteban, go to Flecker, and then go to Elizabeth.
Sure. I was going to say this in response to the question anyway. So one thing to check out is the Union Co-ops Council. If you're interested in more of that side of the questions, they have all kinds of materials you can check out. The easiest landing page is to just start on the usworker.coop website and navigate your way there. There's also a group called More Perfect Union or Perfect Union. They're on Twitter, they're on Instagram, they're on YouTube, and they're covering, it's like journalism covering the front lines of working people in their efforts to have union drives or the failed union. I mean, they're covering all this. They're talking to and interviewing sex workers. They're talking to people in Amazon warehouses, like all of those things. There's no journalism about this work. They fired all of the staff who used to cover union beats. And so these are, it's like the people who were running the campaigns for the Justice Democrats have now turned into, I think it was the guy who was the communications director for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016 and again in 2020. So those are the people. Those are also really interesting stories that I know I don't hear otherwise. If you're interested in following more there, and otherwise, stay involved in this community. There's definitely a lot of stuff on the solidarity economy side, the New Economy Coalition, the resources that Selk has on their website, the resources that we have on our website for Aorta. Aorta.coop is our website. These are all just movements to follow. That's how you find what really is your passion, is scan everything and then see what resonates. And then there's always going to be an opportunity to connect and go further in that work.
Thank you. Flecker, do you want to share some next steps or resources?
Yeah, so we're based in Cincinnati. We have an Ohio network. If you are on the national and a different state, I think the Union Co-op Council is a great source to connect with unions and see what type of resources you can get. If you still want to ask me, I have union contacts around the country, so I can also make an introduction. Often it's about relationships. There are thousands of locals in the country, so you can have a union in Arizona that has an area that maybe is anti-immigrant, and the leadership, they are democratic organization, the leadership can be also anti-immigrant, but that's a small minority. But it's about relationships. So I'll be able to hook you up there. If you're in Ohio, give me a call. And just one last note, just something, I know there's a big bad press on unions, and it's really an attack on working class people. Unions, 90% of the political funding from unions are going to the left agenda. Republicans know that. So by hurting unions, they want to hurt the funding to the left agenda. So don't believe the crap that typically they say in the media, because it's a very systematic approach to destroy the brand and the name of solidarity with unions. So speak to your unions and let me know if I can be of any help.
Thank you. Elizabeth, do you want to share how people can get involved in NICNOC?
La gente en el trabajo.
Oh, Elizabeth, you're on mute. Can you unmute? Oh, thanks.
Ok, se había silenciado.
Okay, I wasn't muted.
Ok.
Okay,
¿Me podía repetir? Porque
so I'm going to repeat because
silenciado, se había silenciado.
I had been on mute.
Repetir la pregunta, por favor.
So the question again, please.
No la escucho.
Can you
If you could-
share how people can get involved in NICNOC?
No le escucho. No,
Mm.
sí.
I'm gonna drop the,
No, doble voz. No,
so that's the
doble voz se
website.
escucha.
Enigma. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Well, our event is, we're at time, but thank you all. I want to really thank the participants and also the panelists. Please check out our other Co-op-Palooza events that are happening tomorrow. Please consider donating to the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And most importantly, please continue doing this great work and collaborating. And yeah, good to see everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Gracias, Elizabeth.
Gracias a todos. Chao.
Gracias.